Welcome to a brand new season of Think Governance. In this series, we unpack King 5, a bold new standard for ethical leadership, accountability, and sustainable value creation in South Africa. Join us as we explore what this means for directors, business leaders, and governance professionals shaping the future.
Hello everyone. Today I have the absolute pleasure of talking with Ansie Ramalho, current chair of the King Committee. She's been on the King Committee for over 15 years, and she was also the main drafter of both King 4 and now King 5. Ansie, thank you so much for joining me.
An absolute pleasure, Parmi.
So Ansie, you've been part of this King journey for so many years now. What makes King 5 a milestone moment in this journey?
It's become part of the King tradition, I think, to keep on pushing the boundaries of our understanding of what corporate governance is and what it should represent. With King 1, whereas most, if not all, other codes internationally at that stage, the early 90s, addressed the financial aspects of corporate governance, King 1, as we talk about it now, introduced employees and ethics as part of governance considerations. King 2 put forward the concept of the triple bottom line, which was also revolutionary at that time in 2002. King 3, we brought up the notion of the triple context. We moved from triple bottom line to triple context, stakeholder inclusivity, integrated reporting. King 4 followed integrated reporting with integrated thinking, and then King 4 was outcomes-based, which was also a really novel concept. We put corporate governance forward as something that must be evaluated on its outcomes and not on the input of its practices. So before you can say that there's good corporate governance in place, you can not only look at the practices that have been implemented, you also have to look at the results, the outcomes of those practices. So that's the journey so far. I believe King 5 will be no different. And the two milestones in my mind are firstly, one that is subtle but a significant paradigm shift. And that's a paradigm shift or a different thinking that must take place when governing bodies consider what is in the best interest of the organization. Now, with what we put forward in King 4, I think there's often been the misunderstanding that stakeholder inclusivity, taking into account the triple context, that organizations should seek where they can find mutual benefit or mutual overlap between their own interest and that of their stakeholders or that of their context, and that they must strategize in that way. King 5 says that is good, but it's not going far enough, because just looking at overlap is not covering the reality. The reality is that organizations are embedded, they surrounded, we can almost say, by their economic, social, and environmental context. Being surrounded by this context means that they're absolutely dependent on the wealth and health and well-being of this context. So when you act in the organization's interest, it is indeed in the interest of the organization to contribute to the health of your context. So it's no longer good enough or sufficient where we find ourselves as humanity to only look at those overlaps or those intersections of interest. Organizations should proactively contribute, create value within the systems that they operate. So that's the one subtle but significant shift. The other one, which is not so subtle, is of course the introduction of the disclosure framework. And the disclosure framework is something that the King Committee is now introducing to address transparency around corporate governance reporting, to ensure that corporate governance reporting is accessible in one place. Currently, if stakeholders, shareholders and stakeholders, if they want to access reporting on governance, they actually have to work through the whole annual report or the whole integrated report to get a sense of the quality of governance at the organization. What we're trying to do now is to say there's one access point where you can immediately find the disclosure on King 5, and that's the disclosure framework. The other reason why we introduced the disclosure framework is because it will hopefully standardize and bring consistency into the disclosure of corporate governance.
So one of the things that came up in some of the questions that came to me after the code was released, or the draft code was released for comments, was why we removed the practices around disclosure from the actual code. And of course, that linkage then to the disclosure framework comes through, because many of those practices are now sitting in the disclosure framework, which will be a requirement for organizations to do if they wish to claim application of King 5 going forward. So I think this is a really big shift in terms of, one, transparency around governance, but also to accountability for organizations and what they're really doing in terms of governance. So you've mentioned this paradigm shift, the disclosure framework. I think those are two very pressing or key changes that came through. But what were some of the other pressing reasons for this update of this code right now? So what were some of the changes in the governance landscape locally and internationally that resulted in us deciding it's time for King 5?
Right. So you know, a code of corporate governance is only useful insofar as it is relevant. It does not get applied and implemented in a vacuum. Organizations are faced with certain challenges, and so it's the task of the code to assist organizations to contend with those challenges. Now, the King Committee is a standing committee. It meets every quarter, and the reason why we do so is to track changes in the corporate and developments in the corporate governance landscape. If we look at that landscape currently, we see that there's growing complexity, that the landscape is marked by increasing volatility and uncertainty. If we just look at the consequences of climate change, the disruption of supply chains, and how that has increased insurance cost and compliance cost. And then we look at geopolitical conflicts and conflicts in terms of wars, but also tensions that are introduced globally. In terms of tariffs, export duties, sanctions, regulatory reforms that have repercussions internationally. And that affects the stability of the global trade environment, makes it very difficult for organizations to operate within such uncertainty. If you add to that misinformation, which affects reputations, which causes social division, the fast pace of technology development. In South Africa specifically, we have growing inequality, unemployment. All of these things add to this very difficult operating environment. Now, we had to review the King Code. I'll remind you that King 4 was issued in 2016, so 9 years ago. And we had to review the King Code to ensure that it was still fit for these challenging times. A code of corporate governance should be fit to equip organizations to navigate these challenges and to formulate coherent strategy that enables them to capture the opportunities that also come from the external environment, but still maintain their ethical and effective governance. South Africa specifically, we had the changes to the Companies Act. Those changes mirror the social challenges. The Social and Ethics Committee has been given more prominence in the Companies Act. And then, of course, remuneration, which speaks to the inequality point that I've just mentioned. And then something that affects all organizations, especially the larger ones, of course, is of course the introduction of international sustainability reporting standards, which we had to take into account and see how we were going to deal with that in our code for corporate governance in South Africa. So it's really a function of the time that has lapsed and all of these challenges in the and developments in the operating environment that prompted us to look at reviewing King 4.
So can you expand a little bit on the approach that's been taken in King 5 with regards to sustainability reporting, materiality, etc.? What are some of the changes there?
I think the most significant change is, maybe not a change, but a clarification, is the issue of double materiality. When we drafted King 4, that terminology was not in play as yet. We did make it very clear that we wanted organizations to take into account not only the effect that their stakeholders and external factors have on them, but also the impact that organizations have on their external environment, society, and stakeholders. Now, in King 5, we definitively call that, we mention double materiality, and we definitively support double materiality. And I know that there may be those who say that, well, it's very likely that as South Africa, we will adopt the International Sustainability Standards Board's standards, the ISSB standards, and that we must keep in step with these. And the ISSB standards follow, of course, a single materiality or a financial materiality approach, which says that organizations need to report on factors that would affect financial performance and future cash flows. We don't believe that our stance goes against that. We just go further than that. So we say, yes, if the ISSB standards are introduced, those can be used, but we would prefer South African organizations to build on that and go beyond that, go further. Also report the other dimension of materiality, namely how organizations are affecting their external environment, the natural environment and society and external stakeholders.
So one of the aims that we mentioned to the public when we started this King 5 project was to simplify and improve accessibility. What does that look like now in practice with regards to the principles, the recommended practices, the required disclosures, etc.?
We wanted to improve accessibility and simplify, and the simplification is also a means by which to improve accessibility, not for the sake of simplification or accessibility, but because we want to make it as easy as possible for organizations and for other users of King 4, like shareholders and the media and so on, to really understand what is required, to make it easy to read, to understand, to interpret, and to implement. And so, and it's no mean feat. You were involved, Parmi, you know, it's no mean feat converting technical knowledge into something that is simple and straightforward. And we did our best, but I do think it is a definite improvement on what it was. So we have reduced some of the practices. What we saw in the comments when King 5 draft was out for public comment was that there were many calls for guidance. Now, I think what we need to say to each other here is that a code of corporate governance is not primarily intended to be guidance. Yes, of course, if you read through it, there will be guiding practices, but a code is not the most suitable place to incorporate guidance. You could never do justice. In terms of practices, the code really include the most critical practices that are required so as to give expression to the objective or to achieve the objective as per the principle. So that was the one point of simplification whereby which we wanted to simplify. Just as an aside, I recall that King 2 was a report as thick as this. And then with King 3, we reduced it quite significantly, but there were almost 700 recommended practices.
Really? Wow.
In King 3.
Sure.
In King 4, I don't know the exact number of practices, but we reduced it significantly, less than half. And in King 5, it will be reduced even further. We also combined some of the principles where we thought that they were very closely aligned to achieving the same objective. Like, for example, we combined the organizational ethics principle with the corporate citizenship principle, because really what is corporate citizenship? It's an expression of the organization acting and behaving ethically. We also changed the presentation. This speaks now directly to accessibility. We changed the presentation of the code. You know, it's a psychological thing. If you look at the report, and the report, by the way, consists of the code, the glossary, the disclosure framework, and then a document which we call foundational concepts, which explain the philosophical principles behind King 5. If you look at all of that combined as the King 5 report, it looks like a thick document like this. And you almost feel like giving up on reading it before you even started. What we've done now is to deconstruct, to present all of these documents separately, so we don't give a combined King 5 report. And we believe just the navigation of it will be easier, and the cross-referencing of it will be easier, the way that we are presenting it now. So we sincerely hope that will make King 5 more accessible and easier to interpret and apply.
So, Ansie, we've already spoken about some of the shifts, some of the developments, the disclosure framework, now simplification, accessibility. Are there any other major content changes that you think we haven't mentioned coming through now in King 5 that weren't there in King 4?
I think I need to mention the data, information, and technology principle. So in King 4, we had the information and technology principle, but that is one area that has changed absolutely significantly since King 4. And what was very tricky in King 5 was to differentiate these related concepts so that we could manage the drafting of it. So those who read the draft of King 5, you would have seen that we differentiated these concepts. I'm talking now about data, technology, and information in a specific way. Where we landed in the end, and I have to say this is where the public comments were very useful. We had some really good contributions here in helping us making sense of it. Where we've landed now is to say that data, information, and technology, and then you throw AI and emerging technologies into the mix, they are all related concepts, and even though we deal with it separately as data, information, and technology, we also appreciate that you can't separate them completely. So that's how that principle should be read, to understand that these components are interrelated, but for the sake of the drafting and for sake of introducing recommended practices, we had to deal with them under separate headings, but the one affects the other. That's how it should be read.
So I guess that's the one people need to pay careful attention to amongst all the other changes.
Right. We tweaked some of the factors that could affect independence by introducing related parties. So independence and that, although we now specifically mention it, if you think about it, you could never consider a person's independence, a director, for example, and not take into account the interest that that director's spouse may have, especially if it's a significant interest. So we've introduced, or we've refined that, shall I rather say, and then the big one, the 9 years. The 9 years. The fact that that the governing body had to consider whether a governing body member was independent after having been on the board for 9 years was in King 4. We've now moved it up as one of the factors, but if you read the practice recommendation just below, it says all of these factors must be taken into account holistically and substance over form. And the same goes for 9 years. So just as the board in terms of King 4 had to consider the 9-year period, that remains true for King 5.
I'm so glad you raised independence, because whilst this is not new, as you say, I still see so much misunderstanding of it.
Indeed.
I read the other day that King 5 introduces a new 9-year rule where you can no longer be independent after 9 years. And that's such a misinterpretation of what the intention is with King 5.
Yeah.
So you've already mentioned the commentary you received around information technology and data in this public consultation process that took place. Was there any other feedback that you felt stood out to you? Were there any surprising perspectives that you found came through from the 136 comment letters that were received on the draft of King 5?
Commentary is always very interesting, and it's very helpful because, well, first of all, you get diverse input from such a wide variety of submissions from people coming from various, and organizations coming from various perspectives, and with diversity becomes robust challenge, and that's very good. And even where a comment's been made that we didn't necessarily agreed with, it clearly showed where the intent with the drafting was misaligned with how it was interpreted in many instances. And then as the drafter, you have to take responsibility for it and make sure that it isn't misinterpreted, that you're clear enough in how you style it, how you word it. So that was very helpful, and we rephrased a number of things because of the comments that we've received. As you said, with data, information, and technology, that was very useful. we received comments. What we wanted to do at the time that we issued the draft was to combine the risk and the compliance principles. And we received very helpful comments, comments that we took on board, which argued against it, and quite convincingly, obviously, because we changed it back to 2 separate principles, which leads us now into the unfortunate situation, Parmi, that we have 13 principles. But generally very helpful in terms of showing, the commentary was very useful in terms of showing where we needed to rephrase, redraft, reconsider. There were lots of finer points that we could tweak because of the comments that we have received.
So the drafting of King 5 began early in 2024. We then sent out this draft for public comment that we've just spoken about in around February of 2025. And now we're near the launch of 31 October. Walk us through the process from initial thoughts and discussions to today's final product where we sit now.
We actually, in 2023, we started the King Committee established a task team under the chairmanship of Muhammad Adam. And what we asked the task team to do is to just look at the corporate governance landscape and all the developments that we need to pay particular attention to, and then come with a recommendation as to whether we need to look at updating King 4. Now, at that point in time, most of us were firmly of the view that we will only need an update, that we wouldn't need a King 5, so maybe King 4.1 or something. Yeah. And then I believe that was the same with when King 3 was done, and definitely it was the same when King 4 was done. It started with the idea to be an update, and then it morphed into something else. Back to the task team. The task team pointed out some of these developments in the corporate governance landscape, as I've already spoken about, and identified the areas that needed to be updated. So once the King Committee considered all of these and stood back, looked at the big picture, we actually saw other opportunities for improvement. For example, we reflected on how effective King 4 has been and its successes and where maybe it could be improved. And then one of the areas for improvement that was identified was its disclosure. The disclosure on King 4, and I'll remind you again that King 4 is outcomes-based, so disclosure particularly important. And it was disappointing. Yeah. We said to ourselves, this wasn't where we wanted it to be. And so this debate around how we're going to improve disclosure, how we're going to make it easier for organizations to know exactly what they need to report on, disclose on, and also make it easier for shareholders and stakeholders to access those reports. And that we came up with the idea of the framework, which we initially called the template. And then the simplification got introduced as another aspect of it, simplification of the report overall. And of course, once you start talking about the disclosure framework, taking some of the disclosure practices, including them in the framework, you talk about simplification, well, then you start talking about a rewrite. But I want to emphasize, though, that in substance, a lot of detail has changed. In substance, not so much has changed, other than the introduction of the disclosure framework, the rewrite of the data, information, and technology principle, and then perhaps that philosophical tweak that governing bodies should understand that making decisions in the best interests of the organization must always mean to take into account contributing to the economic, social, and environmental system in which it operates. It's because of that symbiotic relationship.
So, Ansie, I mentioned in the intro that you were the main drafter of King 5, but tell us a little bit about the team supporting you in this big project and also the role of the King Committee in approvals, etc.
So I had my fingers on the keyboard, Parmi, but I have to say that the King Committee is the drafter, and especially the advisory group. Now, the advisory group consisted of all of the independent members on the King Committee. Those are people who are on the King Committee in their individual capacity. They're not representing another organization. They're there in the individual capacity. So all of those individuals formed the advisory group, and they worked very hard without any compensation whatsoever in challenging and giving advice on the drafting of King 5. And this is also my opportunity to really thank them for all of the hard work, for all of their wisdom that they shared during this process. And we had strong challenges sometimes and really vehement disagreement. But I hope that I believe that that King 5 is all the better for it. And then also we need to thank the King Committee members, especially the organizations represented on the King Committee. So what we're trying to do with the composition of the King Committee is to really keep it representative of the regulators and the professional bodies that have a stake in corporate governance in South Africa. And all of these representative organizations that were represented considered the report, the code, and provided us with input from their organizations, which we then also took into account in addition to the public comments. And then as the King Committee, or as the advisory group, shall I rather say, we reached out to technical experts in various areas, because the code covers a wide spectrum of technical subjects. We consulted, we invited challenge, we asked these technical people to please review what we had. That was ad hoc reaching out on these issues, and we also need to thank them for all of their contributions. And then, of course, Parmi, you and the IoDSA. So the King Committee, the house of the King Committee is the IoDSA, and you were very generous hosts during this whole process with all of the support that you've given us.
So before we wrap up, Ansie, I think important for us to cover is, what do we say to organizations who come to us and say, another King Code? What a burden. I already have so many other compliance matters to deal with. What would the response be?
I would say it's not another code. It's not another burden. It's an easier code. And I please want organizations to see it from that perspective, because it is more succinct, it's simplified, it's to the point. The disclosure framework specifically, we've taken out all the more generalized requirements for disclosure. Whereas in King 4, we would, for example, have a requirement to disclose your arrangements that you have in place as an organization for enterprise risk management. We are now asking specific questions. We would, for example, rather than that, ask a governing body to indicate whether it is satisfied with its arrangements for organization-wide risk management. And then you indicate your satisfaction rather than the more general arrangements. One of our main objectives, and I'm repeating the point, but one of the main objectives was really to make it easier for organizations to apply King 5.
And then lastly, what is your hope for acceptance into the market and the ultimate application of King 5?
Firstly, around the disclosure framework. I hope that the way that we've approached it, the way that we have set it up, will lead to more meaningful engagement around corporate governance. Now, if I say more meaningful engagement, I'm talking about engagement within the organization, so between the governing body and management, and a more intentional application of the mind as to which practices we implement, which practices we maybe adapt for our purposes, or maybe even in terms of proportionality, we don't implement, but then we are very clear on the rationale for it and why we're doing it. So more engagement internally, but also more engagement externally. I hope that the disclosure framework will assist organizations and shareholders and other stakeholders to, because of the higher degree of transparency, that there would be more engagement from that perspective as well, and just more accountability, so that the level of accountability is risen, not as a sanction, but just as a good governance principle. It is an opportunity for organizations to showcase their corporate governance, which is surely to your own benefit as an organization. And so really my hope is that the disclosure framework will lead to it. The other point of engagement that I haven't specifically mentioned is, of course, the engagement of regulators with organizations. Now, there are 4 regulators so far who have endorsed the code specifically for use, including the JSE, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, the Auditor General of South Africa, and National Treasury. I believe that using the framework, again, not as a sanction, but as a point of engagement, an opportunity for organizations to showcase, to demonstrate their corporate governance, will make a big difference. So yes, so that's my one wish for King 4 is that there be more transparency, accountability, and engagement on corporate governance because of the disclosure framework. My second hope, wish, expectation is that King 5 equips organizations to navigate this extremely complex, uncertain, volatile operating environment, that they are able to manage the risks, capture the opportunities, whilst maintaining ethical and effective leadership. And then lastly, very importantly though, is that my hope is that King 5 reinforces corporate governance as a change agent. I remember when I did the presentation at the launch of King 4, I started the presentation by mentioning that I believe corporate governance is a change agent. And that thinking and that expectation is as true, even if not more, with King 5. Organizations, the way that they are governed, the consequences of their operations affect society, well, the economy, society, and the natural environment. And in that way, organizations shape the economy, society, and the natural environment. And this happens and it affects us now, but also future generations. So I hope that King 5 positions the importance of this responsibility on the governing bodies of our organizations. Private business organizations, but especially state-owned entities, non-profits, civil society organizations, SMEs, all of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ansie, for your wisdom in this interview. We've really got such useful nuggets out of you in anticipation of this launch. You mentioned the amount of hours put in by the advisory group members, by the IoDSA, etc., but no one has put in as many hours as you have. So really, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much for all the work you've done on this project, and really looking forward to taking it forward with you and really seeing the real difference it can make.
I enjoyed it. It was a passion project.
That was clearly evident. Thank you again, Ansie. Thank you to you for watching. Please visit the IoDSA website. There's a specific King 5 webpage where you will find lots more information and useful resources. Thank you. Bye-bye.